Hey everyone, I am Mike Settele and welcome to Step 8. As always, please like this video if you made it this far so I can keep track of just who's still with us. And in this step, we are going to talk about sacrifices. Now, I know that sounds scary, so let's just make sure we talk about our goal first. We can put this in perspective. Basically, our last step, on step 7, the goal was that right isn't always right. Basically, what I was saying is that efficiency matters. We need to master the middle, get those easy and medium questions right confidently every single time. Now we're kind of flipping things. Wrong isn't always wrong. So that means that some wrong answers are okay. This is a step where we need to be realistic about what we can achieve and what we can get right and what maybe is a worthy sacrifice. So just to get some numbers in here, if you are scoring a 600 or a 650 on one of the subjects for practice test 2, you are not going to get an 800 on the real exam. There is not that much time and you're too far away. So give up on that goal. But we can still do really, really well if we are smart about which questions that we sacrifice. For example, giving up on 2 or 3 hard math questions might give us time to save the other 3 or 4. So we would lose maybe 50 points for those 2 or 3 really hard ones, but we would gain 50 points for those other hard ones that we have a chance at answering. What most people do is they are losing all 100 of those points because they're trying to get all of those hard questions right, and they just really can't do it in the time limit. So make sure you are not trying to do too much. That is where points get lost. So if we are smart about this and we make sacrifices, we can actually increase our score because we are directing our time and our attention to the stuff that's going to give us the most points, get us the highest numbers. So let's talk about some tasks that we want to make sure we're going to accomplish for step 8. There's not going to be many links in this description because we've done a lot of stuff. You should kind of know where to go already. But you should be spending the next several days just working on hard questions. Really challenge yourself. So in the question bank, the College Board question bank, these are going to be those 3-box questions, right? So you can sort by difficulty in the question bank. We sorted out the 3-box ones for the last step, step 7, but now we're going to bring those back in. We're not going to ignore those anymore. So if we have successfully mastered the middle, as we said, then we realize now with these hard questions that doing well in the SAT isn't just about memorizing facts and rules and formulas and things like that. We've got to be able to put those facts together in just the right way. The hard questions in a lot of cases are really just about solving a puzzle. And if you're one of my channel members and you want to do some hard questions, look for any playlist that involves the word twists. Okay, that's basically my word for hard questions. And I really love that word twist because it kind of encapsulates what we're really talking about and how the SAT makes a hard question. So if we took something simple like y equals mx plus b, that's a basic idea. What the SAT is going to do is start twisting that up so that it's unrecognizable, so that the question is still about y equals mx plus b, but in a way that most people are not going to know. It's going to be disguised. So we see this all the time, even on some pretty basic things where they start to twist that up, right? Maybe they switch out the y in y equals mx plus b for an f of x. Maybe they swap the positions of the m and b, the slope and the y-intercept. Maybe they stop writing it in y equals mx plus b form and they give us like some other weird version of a line. Maybe they start asking us to shift the line up and down or left and right. We have to deal with the translation. Maybe they're twisting it up and disguising it by putting it in a story. And they don't even use the word line anymore. And so we have to realize that it's still a line, even if there's a story with it. Or maybe sometimes they'll deliberately try to trick us. Maybe they'll give us a line, but they'll tell a story in a way that it maybe sounds like an exponential equation. And so we start thinking about exponents when really it's just a line. And we got to pay attention to the way things are worded. So your job is to look at those hard questions, know that it's really still about the same basic topics that we did in step 7 that we've been memorizing all along. And your job is to untwist that hard question so that it looks like those basic things again. Because if it's basic, then in theory, you know it, right? You've memorized all those things. But with the hard ones, we're really not trying to memorize the steps to a process. It's about cleverness. It's about experimenting with things, taking chances, using the strategies, but also knowing when to quit. And this is why we have to create a sacrifice plan. We should definitely be using this step 8, to challenge ourselves, to try the hardest questions we can find, either in the question bank, my channel, wherever. But you should also be thinking about what you would skip. We're going to create a sacrifice plan so that we know when we're taking the real test, which questions are worth our time and which questions are just about picking your favorite letter. And you're going to know this because, you'll do a question, you'll get it wrong or struggle with it or whatever, and then you'll watch my review video of the question. And even after knowing the answer, if you're still like, I'm lost here, then yeah, it's not for you. Some questions are not for you. That's totally fine. The timing on the SAT, especially the hard modules, is very, very tight for most people. That will never go away. It's the same for me too. So we just have to deal with that reality. So in the hard module, especially, you're going to need to make very quick choices. I'm going to try this question, not that question. So maybe revisit some of the older videos that we've talked about those big picture strategies. Think about the pacing videos again. Which questions should we spend our time on? Which ones should we sacrifice? In those videos where I talk about how to score X, right? How to score 700 in math, how to score 650 in reading. I often talk at the end about how many questions you're allowed to get wrong to still get that score. You should be thinking about that as you're coming up with your sacrifice plan. If your goal is to get a 700 in math, you can get a lot of questions wrong, hard questions, and still get there. So really try to think about that buffer that you're building in to see, like, what can I do wrong to get the number of questions right that I really need, and where can I focus my time to make sure I'm maximizing my score. I will also give the walkthrough links again. Some of you may have watched some of those for step 7. They're great for step 8 as well. If in step 7, maybe you watched one test, then in step 8, just watch me do another, but this time focus on when I get to the hard questions. What do I do to deal with those hard questions? And if maybe you split them up a different way, maybe in step 7, you watch just the first modules. Now you've got the hard modules. But as always with the walkthroughs, these are the ones where I just take the entire test for the first time, never having seen the questions. So my explanations aren't great, right? I'm kind of figuring it out in the moment. So my explanations for the hard ones might not be the best. But at the very least, you can see that I'm thinking about sacrifices, that I'm choosing which questions I'm going to do. And I've been doing this for 15 years. And if I still have to come up with a plan for sacrificing questions, you're going to be in the same boat for sure. So you got to embrace that. And it's not going to be up to the same plan for everyone. So for example, in reading, you have to decide, is it better to completely sacrifice 2 or 3 hard passages? Don't even look at them, just kind of know you're going to guess randomly on them. Or is it better to kind of place a smart bet on questions and try to get to as many as possible, but knowing that when you pick that answer, you're not 100% sure? I don't know what the best plan is for you, but basically, you're going to have to pick something and decide what you're going to do before you sit down for that test, so that when you get to those moments of crisis, you have something ready to go. To put some numbers to it, for example, with the passages, if there are 10 passages, 10 hard passages in the hard module, which seems about right, we could go 2 ways with it, right? We could say, what I usually do is I like to think about when I'm picking an answer, I'm getting to like 80% confidence. Right? Maybe I could read that passage one more time and be really sure about it. But if I get to a point of like 80% confidence, I usually move on. And I'm like, all right, I'm placing a smart bet on this choice, but I'm going to move on and hope for the best. 80%, not bad, right? If I have 80% confidence on 10 questions, odds are good I'll get 8 questions right and 2 wrong. And I'm okay with that sacrifice. Now, some of you prefer to go a different way. You want to be 100% confident on every answer you pick. It's not necessarily that's wrong, but you got to think about it as sacrifices and trade-offs, right? If you are 100%, you might need to take an extra minute on each of those questions to get from 80% to 100%. And maybe you feel really good about that and you're definitely getting those questions right, but that time goes somewhere. Right now, you don't have as much time. So maybe with that 100% confidence, you can only do that for 6 of the 10 questions. And then the other 4, you're out of time. So you just got to guess randomly. Now, you'd still have a 25% chance of guessing right. But if we do the math on that, 600% and 4, 25%, that's only going to get us 7 questions right and 3 wrong. So that's a little worse than if we had just gotten to 80% confidence. So which plan is better? It's close. Some of you, for personality reasons, cannot let go of a question until you are sure you are right. And I think that's going to hurt you. But if that's just how your brain works, then you got to do the math and figure out what you're going to sacrifice along the way so that you can get to 100% confidence on more questions. Now, this is also complicated by the fact that many of you are just not very good at evaluating your own confidence in your answer. So think back to your practice test, especially practice test number 2, your second one. How many times did you get a question wrong that you didn't bookmark, right? You got it wrong and it's a surprise. That's not good. That means that you were 100% confident in a wrong answer. That cannot happen. If you want a top score, if you want 750, maybe even 700, you can never be getting a question wrong by surprise. And that's why we have to always be thinking about the bookmarks. Now, you can still get stuff wrong. I do, but I see it coming. I'm going to bookmark a question where I feel like I don't know what's going on. And then when I get it wrong, I'm like, yeah, well, no surprise there. I was confused. I was running out of time, right? So as long as you're thinking about this, we can start to come up with a good plan. And I think that that's the key. If you are willing to accept this, you will see improvement. If you are willing to accept that you are going to have to sacrifice some questions or at least plan ahead and have something ready to go in case that happens, in case you're running out of time, you are more likely to do better. Because even I, after all these years of taking SATs, I have a plan for which questions I'm going to sacrifice if the clock is ticking down to 0. In reading, it's the charts and graphs. I hate those questions, so those are always the last ones I do. I also don't like the support and weaken questions. I find that they kind of just take a lot of time, and sometimes they're confusing answer choices. So I'm always saving those for last. I'm skipping around and kind of getting everything else done, and then hopefully I'll have time to go and do the charts and graphs, support and weaken. But if not, at least I am leaving blank or guessing randomly on the questions where I knew I just didn't have as good of a chance of getting it right. Same thing in math. When I get to around question 15, especially in that hard module, I stop going in order. I'm going to do the questions that I think are going to be the fastest and most strategy-based. So I'm looking for those plug points into equations questions. I'm looking for places where I could just use Desmos pretty confidently. Now, if I get to a weird geometry question, I'm going to skip it. I'm confident I could solve it. I mean, I can get 800s in math, no problem. But yeah, occasionally, something slows you down. And if a weird geometry question doesn't have some sort of neat little strategy I can use, it might be 3 minutes to get that right. And when you have very little time left on the clock, 3 minutes is a long time. Maybe in that 3 minutes, I could have gotten 2 other questions right. So I'm constantly thinking about these things as I'm going through the test, and you need to be too. So let's summarize what we got here. As we said, the goal is wrong isn't always wrong. Everyone's going to need to make sacrifices. Our goal is to get the highest score possible in the time limit. And we are limited in lots of ways, not just by the time, but by the topics that show up on our particular test. We're limited by the vocabulary words that we happen to study and that show up on our test. Maybe if we're not native English speakers, we're limited by our knowledge of the English language. Our math ability might be limited. Maybe our reading speed is limited. Some people are slow readers. It happens. So we need to plan around those limits. And that's why our highest priority is priorities, having priorities, right? Think about what you're going to do with the time you've got to get the most points possible. And a big mistake here with everyone's, trying to get the best scores possible, a big mistake is making your score goal an 800. If your goal is an 800, you are less likely to achieve that goal than if your goal was a 750. And that's because someone who's planning for a 750 has planned for errors, has planned for stumbles, has some mental ability to understand that their thing might not go perfectly, and they're ready for those stumbles. Now, if someone who has an 800 who's planning for an 800, that's someone who doesn't have a plan in case things go wrong. That's arrogance. And all it takes is one weird math question, one passage that just sucks you in for 5 minutes that takes a little longer than usual. And boom, now the whole plan is gone. Now you're going to run out of time. You're rushing through things that you'd normally be getting right confidently. So you got to plan ahead. Otherwise, when that bump in the road happens, your car is going to crash. And we cannot let one bump completely throw us off our plan. So, and similar to that, our lowest priority here is memorization. As I said before, hard questions are not about memorizing steps. This is especially true in math, and I think that that's a hard habit to break for a lot of people. In school, even in AP Calculus, you are learning steps to do a particular derivative. You practice those steps for homework. You see lots of different questions, but they're all basically the same steps, and you do them again and again, and then you can do them in your sleep. And then when it comes time for the test, you're just repeating those steps. So you're doing the same steps on the test that you learned in class. But the SAT is not like that. There will always be surprises, especially on the hard questions. So if you are trying to memorize steps, you are setting yourself up for, surprises that you are not prepared for. So we have to kind of remember steps that are a little more flexible. That's why plug points into equations is my favorite math strategy. I don't care what the rest of the question looks like. There's points and there's equations. I'm going to plug it in and see what happens. And I can deal with the weirdness of the question aside from that. And this is true in reading too. Even topics that are supposedly very, very predictable sometimes have these surprising moments. The semicolon is a great example of this. We know especially if you've been practicing, that the semicolon is used as a period. It's the same as a period, right? We have a sentence beforehand, a sentence after. Every time I see a semicolon in an answer choice, I'm checking. Do I have a sentence before? Do I have a sentence after? But every once in a while, the semicolon will get to the sentences and we'll see that it's being used in a weird way. It's being used in that way where we have a complicated list and the semicolon is used to separate those items in the list. That's weird. But I'm not bothered by that. I know it could come up and it doesn't really come up often, but when it does, I can adjust to that change. I see, oh, these are not sentences in the normal way. This is a list. So I'll use that other rule. The transitions also kind of often have this little bit of an exception. I wouldn't say often, but they do have this exception where, I know my favorite strategy for the transition questions is the same category rule, right? So if we dumb summarize those answer choices, we might have 2 words that mean but, 2 words that mean so, and we can cross them both out because if they mean the same thing, well, how could one be right and the other wrong? But occasionally there's enough of a difference between those 2 words that maybe one is right and the other is wrong. But when that happens, as I'm reading that sentence and I'm looking at the other 2 answers, I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. And then I have to adjust, and I'm okay putting that strategy aside and just dealing with the special circumstances. No SAT strategy works 100% of the time. But if it works 90% of the time, 85% of the time, that's a great strategy. So we're definitely going to use it as much as we can. But if we need to break a rule, break the rule. By this point, you've studied enough, you've practiced enough, you've seen enough questions that you should know when things are a little off, right? When there's a twist that is unexpected and requires you to be flexible. I wish it were the case that we could have certain rules for the SAT that are just, pretty set in stone. But very little on the SAT is going to be describable as always do this, never do that. For every always, for every never, we're going to get an exception, maybe once every 10 years, but we will get some sort of exception. That's just how it goes. So if that is what you're expecting, lots of always and nevers, then you're going to be surprised on the SAT in a very bad way. For the hard questions, flexibility is key, and you cannot be flexible if you are not willing to sacrifice some questions. So that's really a tough thing to accept for a lot of people, but it's a big part of this last step before we get to our practice test, our last practice test. So that is one thing to just point out before you go. Our next step, step 9, is going to be our final practice test before you take the real exams. We really want that to count. Try to just internalize all the good stuff you're learning from these hard questions. Hopefully you've mastered the middle in step 7, but make sure before you take that practice test, you have honestly thought about a sacrifice plan. Think about it, write it down, put it in the comments if needed to have some accountability, but you should be going into that last practice test knowing the kinds of questions you are going to skip if you start running out of time and the kinds of questions you're going to do first before the other ones that maybe you're not as good at. So make sure you've got that. Otherwise, when those surprises happen, you will be surprised in a bad way. Make sure you like this video before you go so I know who got all the way to step 8. That's a big accomplishment, so thank you for making it this far. As always, I'm Mike Settele, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of you in step 9 for our last practice test.